Istvan seemed to be growing tired, the blows coming slower as he struggled not only to keep hitting Jinsey, but to keep pushing Henry away. Jinsey waited, still trying to protect his face, and then when Henry fell again on his brother's back, he lashed out, punched Istvan as hard as he could in the throat. Istvan started to gasp, but remained solidly straddling him. Henry kept trying to pull him off, not knowing what else to do. Jinsey sat up as far as he could and wrapped his arms around his brother, drew him as close as possible. Up close, Istvan smelled of stale sweat and something else, something gone rotten. He began struggling the moment he felt Jinsey's arms close around him, but Jinsey locked his hands behind his back and held on. He pressed his face against Istvan's neck. "Shh," he said, as calmly as he could. "It's okay now, Istvan. It's okay. It's just me." Istvan kept struggling behind him. Jinsey caught a glimpse of Henry, looking puzzled now, arresting for a moment his attempts to tear Istvan off him. "It's me," Jinsey said, his voice as a soothing whisper now. "It's me, Jinsey. It's your brother. I'm here now, Istvan. I'm here for you." He kept it up, holding on as Istvan continued to try to break free. Henry had taken a few steps back, confused. Half of him seemed to want to wait, the other half seemed poised to flee. Jinsey kept whispering, trying to soothe his brother until the latter started striking the side of his face with his forehead. He held on as long as he could, his head aching, feeling like something inside his skull was in danger of giving away. Something was wet, and at first he thought he was sweating. But when Istvan's head reared back, he saw that his brow was flecked with blood. "My blood," thought Jinsey, and then Istvan brought his head down again, and Jinsey's hand slipped free, and he felt himself passed out. Disconnected thoughts, a strange fleeting around of his faces, as if all of his past has been condensed into a particular moment, a single space. They swayed all around him and began slowly to spin, flitting close and then fleeing away, more like grotesque, swollen birds than human faces. And then they became birds fluttering across the sky, but strangely stretching too, as if they were leaving parts of themselves behind even as they progressed forward, so that they were more like snakes than birds, only not that either. And then as suddenly as they had come, they had faded and were gone. In their place came a strange repeated noise, a noise which it took him a long time to realize was the sound of a man sobbing. He felt something too, someone shaking him. When he opened his eyes, it was to find his brother still on top of him, but something had changed. His eyes looked different, as if there was someone else inside of the body now, human, alive. Istvan, he had a hand on either side of Jinsey's head and was caressing his face. His forehead was still smeared with blood. Henry was far behind him, huddled near the back wall, still tense, still ready to flee. When he saw Jinsey open his eyes, Istvan's tears changed suddenly to a weird, flat smile. "You're alive," he said. Jinsey struggled to sit up, managed to lift himself to his elbows. "Of course I am alive," he said. "Why wouldn't I be?" I thought I killed you, Estevan said. No such luck, said Jinsey. He straightened further and winced. What? Asked Henry incredulously from near the door. You're friends now? Basically, he just tried to kill you. We should get out of here. We're not friends, said Jinsey. Henry, this is my brother. I don't care who he is, said Henry. He tried to kill you. I didn't mean to, said Estevan. He didn't mean to, said Jinsey. He just got confused. Who's to say he won't get confused again, asked Henry. Look at him. What's wrong with him? I didn't mean to, Estevan claimed again. You just got in the way. It doesn't matter if you meant to or not, said Henry. Jinsey, let's get out of here. Jinsey slowly shook his head. I can't, he said. He's my brother. He's dangerous, claimed Henry, but the steam seemed to be running out of him. He was no longer poised to run, seemed to even to want to be convinced. He just needs to be cleaned up a little, said Jinsey. He's been on his own a while and he's gotten confused. He needs someone to take care of him. But why should that someone be you? Asked Henry. Who else is there for him? Asked Jinsey. There is only me. If I don't help him, nobody will. Henry just shook his head. It's not supposed to work that way, he said. No, said Jinsey, but that's the way it is. Quickly he found himself feeling even more responsible for Estevan than he had before. He got Estevan to take a bath, scrubbed him down, then left him shivering and naked while he went out and found him an old but clean pair of clothes from a local church basement. But it didn't stop there. Soon he was scrounging up food for him, then finding scissors and trimming Estevan's hair and beard, then stealing an old blanket or two from his foster family so that Estevan would be able to stay warm. Not knowing what else to do with Estevan, he left him there in their old apartment, hoping that the complex was unappealing enough that the apartment would remain unoccupied until he could figure out what to do with his brother. At first, Henry would have no part of it. He followed Jinsey around, trying to talk him out of helping his brother, telling him that he had a good new life and that it'd be a shame to ruin it. Jinsey stopped him. I'm not going to ruin it, he said. I'm not planning to leave my foster family, but that doesn't mean I can't help my real brother out a little. When he started walking, Henry continued following, but it's not as easy as that, he said. It won't stop there. At first it was easy. He stole a little food for his brother, not enough to be noticed. At least not at first, but then he saw that his foster mother was buying less and keeping a closer eye on what was in the pantry, so he told Estevan he'd have to find his own food. But how do I do that? Asked Estevan. How were you doing it before? Asked Jinsey, and Estevan pointed to the cabinets in the old apartment. Estevan had simply gone through them one after another, as it turned out, eating everything, including the sauce, before carefully returning each bottle to what he felt was its proper place. So what could Jinsey do but keep sneaking food out, even if now he did it less than before? After a while, though, his brother kept insisting he was hungry, still hungry, and so Jinsey started saving half of his own food and hiding it, smuggling it out whenever he could. He was hungry all the time, but he was helping his brother. Henry kept his distance for a while, then started hanging around him again. When he realized Jinsey was eating less so as to smuggling food to his brother, he started passing food along himself. Not for your brother, he said, at first for you. But even when he must have realized Jinsey was giving most of the food away, he still kept bringing. A few weeks later, Henry even started going along with Jinsey to see Istvan. The first few times he was nervous, ready to bolt if Istvan did anything odd, but when the first incident wasn't repeated, he started to calm down, began to get used to the idea of Istvan. He helped Jinsey became his collaborator in the support of his brother. The three of them might have gone on together like that for a long time. True, it hurt Jinsey's school work to spend so much time looking after Istvan, but Henry was willing to help there, to slipping him the answers during a quiz or writing most of his papers for him. No, they could have gone on like that forever if it hadn't been for Istvan. One day, sitting on the couch, staring in front of him, he said, "I want to come live with you." "You do?" asked Jinsey. Istvan nodded. "It's what I'm supposed to do." He traced a figure in the air. "See," he said. Suddenly he stood up and left the room. Henry and Jinsey exchanged glances. "What was that all about?" asked Henry. "He can't come live with you." "Maybe he should, even if he wanted to. See, would never allow it. They never put two siblings together in foster care, particularly if one of them is troubled." Jinsey opened his mouth to retort, and then realized that Henry was right. He closed his mouth again. "You have to tell him no," said Henry. Jinsey shook his head. "He'll probably just forget about it. He probably already has." He didn't even wait for a response. He just left. But when he came back into the room, he had filled a small box with his few possessions. His blankets were over his shoulders, and he was wearing both pairs of his pants and all three shirts all at once, looking like a child that had tried and failed to dress himself. "I'm ready," he said. "Let's go." The two boys just stared. Henry looked at Jinsey expectantly a moment, and then, when Jinsey had still said nothing, shook his head and left the apartment. "What are we waiting for?" asked Istvan. "Istvan," said Jinsey, and sighed. "You can't go." "Why not?" "They won't let you," said Jinsey. Istvan furrowed his brow. He traced another figure with his finger, stared at the empty air. "Then you come live here instead," he said, somewhat reluctantly. Jinsey shook his head. "I have another life now," he said. "I can't give it up." He watched Istvan's face cloud. "Don't you love me? I'm your brother." "You are my brother," said Jinsey, "and I do love you. I'll help you in all the ways I can, but I have a life too." Istvan's mouth twisted in pain as if he'd been struck, and then he turned around and went back into the bedroom, slammed the door. Jinsey tried the handle, found it locked. "Istvan," he said, "don't be like this. Let me in." He waited, but there was no response. He knocked again, still no response. Parts of his mind were imagining what might be going on behind the door. Imagined Istvan huddled in a corner, crying or trying with a rustle nail to slit his throat, or hanging himself. He shook his head to clear it, but the thoughts kept crowding it in. "Istvan," he said louder this time, "open up." But Istvan wouldn't open. Indeed, even after minutes of knocking, he remained resolutely silent. How long Jinsey had been knocking exactly, he wasn't sure. He only knew that suddenly Henry was there beside him, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from the door, trying to lead him away. "But he might be hurt," said Jinsey. "Or he might be planning to hurt himself." "He's not hurt," said Henry. "He's sulking. Come on, Jinsey, we should leave before he gets mad." They made their way back through the streets, passing through the valves and into the neighborhood beyond. Jinsey's letting Henry lead him along. He couldn't stop thinking about his brother. He wondered if he should have handled the situation differently. But what could he have done with Istvan? It wasn't like he could take him home like a pet or something. Wasn't he already doing all he could realistically do? But for Istvan, whatever he did would never be enough. There would always be something more to do, something left to be done. "What was that?" asked Henry beside him. "What?" he asked, listlessly, hardly bothering to look around. "I thought I saw something," said Henry. "There behind us." He shook his head. "Sorry," he said. "I'm jumpy." They kept going past the colony's headquarters and down Luna Avenue toward their neighborhood. Jinsey felt like his connection to his brother was a thread stretching all the way back to his old apartment, his old neighborhood, a thread growing thinner and thinner and now in danger of snapping. They passed at least into their neighborhood. Before they knew it, they were at Jinsey's house. The two boys stopped on the porch and just stood looking at one another. "Are you going to go back?" Henry finally asked. "I don't know," said Jinsey. "You probably shouldn't," said Henry. "I know," said Jinsey. "But that doesn't mean I won't." Henry nodded once and then raised his hand to say goodbye. He had just stepped off the porch when Istvan appeared. "So this is our new home," said Istvan. He was panting and out of breath. "How did you find us?" asked Jinsey. "I have a right to be here," said Istvan. "It's my home too." He gave a flat, dead smile. He slowly lumbered forward and onto the porch. He opened his arms and made a move as if to hug Jinsey, but when his brother stayed where he was, he let his arms fall. "Aren't you happy to see me?" he asked. "Istvan, go home," said Jinsey. "But this is home," said Istvan. "I'm hungry. What do we have to eat?" He reached out and opened the front door and pushed his way in. Jinsey Foster's mother was standing near the stairway, a shocked look on her face. Istvan was in the kitchen. He sounded more like a bear than a human. He was rattling pots and dumping cans, slamming cupboards, searching for something. "Jinsey," said his foster mother, her voice rising, "who is this man and why is he wearing so many shirts? Can you tell me what's going on?" Not knowing what to say, Jinsey pushed past her. Henry, following Istvan, had dropped most of the cans into a heap on the floor. Now his arms were full of food from the fridge, some of it dropping and falling. He carried it out into the hallway past Jinsey's foster mother and into the living room, where he dumped it on the floor. He sat down cross-legged in front of it and began indiscriminately to eat, his eyes flitting from items to item, trying to construct a pattern. "I'm calling the authorities," his mother said. "No," said Jinsey. "He's not a threat. I'll get him out." "No," said Henry. "You should call them." Jinsey heard the sound of his foster mother's heel snapping against the floor as she made for the place the call. He went to his brother, desperately dragging at his arm. "Come on, Estevan," he hissed. "Stop it." "I'm hungry," Estevan said. "A man's got to eat." "She's calling the police," he said. "You've got to go." "The police," Estevan said, as if astonished. "But why would she call them? This is our home." "It's not your home," said Jincy. "It's my home. Please, Estevan." Estevan sighed and stood up, and for a moment Jincy thought he had won the battle, but then his face went purple. Instead of heading for the door, he went deeper in the house. "This is my home," he was yelling. "This is my home." Jincy turned the corner and saw his foster mother crouch in the corner, arms flung up to protect her head, weeping. Estevan was over her, almost snarling, spittle flicked on his lips. He watched, horrified, as his brother struck her. When Jincy tried to pull him away, he shook him off. "Help is on the way," flashed the vid screen. "Help is on the way." Estevan said, "Jincy, you have to leave now." "It's my home," he said. "You go." "The police are coming," said Jincy, shaking him. "They're going to take you away." Estevan suddenly stopped, his face growing weirdly slack. "The police," he said. "You called the police?" "No, I didn't call the—" "Why would you call them?" he asked, his voice filled with a certain confused wonder. He turned and looked at Jincy, or didn't look at him exactly, but rather seemed to look through him. The look reminded Jincy of that early time when Estevan had tried to kill him. "You're with them," said Estevan, his voice a hissing whisper. "You're one of them." "No," said Jincy. "What are you talking about?" "Get away from me," said Estevan, and reached out, pushed Jincy hard in the chest. Jincy stumbled back, crashed into the wall, then slid the rest of the way down. "You're one of them," Estevan said again. "You're just as bad as they are because you're one of them." "No," he said weakly, not completely believing it. "I'm not one of them." But he didn't get up. He did nothing to stop Estevan. When hearing the sound of a siren coming closer, his brother stumbled past him and out into the hall, and from there into the kitchen and out of the back door. There were a few days when he couldn't do much. First, there was his foster mother to confront and help off the ground, and then Henry to calm down and straighten out his story with, and then shortly after the police. They questioned him, more of an interrogation really, about the man who had invaded the house and assaulted them. Who was he? He claimed not to know. How then had he known what his name was? "But I didn't know what name to call him." "I didn't call him a name." The officer shook his head. "You called him a name. Your mother told us," he said. "She's not my mother," he said. "She's my foster mother." The officer shrugged. "I don't care," he said. "That's not important. How did you know his name?" Jincy kept talking, kept lying, feeding them little bits and pieces, half-truths, until they had poked enough holes in his story that he felt he had no choice but to fall silent, to not say anything at all. But he held out. He felt he didn't reveal that the intruder had been his brother, didn't give the police a name, and that was, he felt, an act of loyalty on his part and should be considered by Estevan a redeeming gesture. He hadn't exactly stood by his brother, but then again, he hadn't betrayed him either. But 4 or 5 hours into the questioning, the officer had smiled and placed his hands flat on the table. "Estevan, the name was," he said. Jincy felt his heart beginning to beat harder. "Are you sure?" he said. "Maybe my foster mother heard it wrong." "Oh, we didn't get it from her," said the officer. "We got it elsewhere." "From your friend Henry?" "Maybe he's not as much of a friend to you as you want him to be." "Estevan Sato," he said. He pretended to read from a piece of paper in front of him. "Hey," he said, "isn't Sato your last name too?" He kept his mouth closed, not talking. Said the officer. "Doesn't matter. We've already gotten everything we need to know to identify him from your friend. Shall I read off what I know?" Jinsey shook his head. "I'll take that as a yes," said the officer, "but before I do, there's just one question I want to ask." He leaned forward. "How could you have ever hoped to hide from us the fact that the so-called home invader was your brother?" He wanted to hate Henry for telling. At first he thought he did, but then gradually he began to take stock of all that Henry hadn't said as well. It became clear as the officer continued to talk that Henry hadn't told them where Estevan had been living or that they'd been seeing him regularly. Henry, as he discovered later after the interrogation was over, had given very little away beyond the fact of Estevan being his brother, and Jinsey had to admit they probably would have come across that fact on their own eventually. Later, once the police were gone and Jinsey was left to have to sort out things with his foster mother, Henry stood by him and told her that yes, Estevan had approached them, that they had met him, but that they had no idea either how disturbing he was or that he had followed them. It was largely Henry and his arguments that calmed her, that kept her from sending him back to the agency to be placed in another family. He had Henry to thank for being able to continue on with his new life. As for Estevan, it was as if he had disappeared. It would be a mistake. Henry convinced him to try to make contact again. Estevan was unstable. If he came back, then that would be the end of Jinsey's new life. He'd be sent to a new family, maybe even sent off-planet where Henry would never see him again. Henry was right, but still Jinsey felt guilty. He felt he was abandoning his brother, and who did his brother have but him? He couldn't stand the thought of his brother entirely and completely alone, living more in the wrapped world within his head than in the real world. And so, even though he knew it was the wrong thing, he found himself one day after partying from Henry after school, walking not toward his home but back toward the valve that led to the Marinara Valley compound. The valve operator recognized him as a boy who had visited earlier, nodded once, and let him through without questioning. The compound looked the same as it had looked the last time he'd been there. Same crumbling buildings, same dirty streets. This time the door was locked. The slit police tape was still there, but had been covered over with more police tape. This set intact. He knocked and then waited, but heard nothing from inside. He knocked again and waited, still nothing. After a while he went out and walked around the building, trying to figure out which windows were the ones to his apartment. Once he thought he knew, he was disappointed. The windows seemed firmly closed and there was no sign of light or movement behind them. What now, he wondered. For a while he just stayed staring at the building, waiting for something significant to happen. Nothing did. Down the street he could see a group of 4 scruffy children playing one of the same futile games he had and Estevan had played as kids. Otherwise the street was empty. Eventually he went back inside. He stripped the police tape away. He wondered if he had the strength to break the door open. He hurled himself against it a few times until his shoulder began to hurt. Without any apparent effect on the door, he stood staring at it. In the end, he went down to the super apartment and rang the bell there. The super seemed surprised to see him. "You're that kid," he said, "the one with the mother who went crazy." "I used to live upstairs," Jinsey said. "Yeah, that's the one," said the super. "That's you. What do you want?" "The key to the apartment," he said. The super shook his head. "It's a crime scene," he said. "The police have taped it off." "Not anymore," said Jinsey. "They came and stripped the tape away." "Yeah," said the super suspiciously. "When did they do that?" Jinsey shrugged. "How should I know?" he asked. "It was already done when I got there." "Here." He held out his hand. "Give me the key." "Why should I give you the key?" asked the super. "There's still back rent owed on the place." "Who's going to cover that?" "Whoever covers that gets the key." "The foster father's a lawyer," lied Jinsey. "I am going to go up and take a look at the place. Make sure the police didn't steal anything. If they did, we're going to sue their ass and yours too." The super stared at him, a little stunned, and then he smiled and shook his head. "No," he said, "can't be true." Jinsey crossed his arms and stood there waiting. After a while the super began to get nervous. He scratched the top of his head. He reached out and began to shut the door, but when Jinsey didn't react, stopped. "A lawyer, you say?" he said. "A lawyer," said Jinsey, holding his gaze steady and unblinking and very litigious. The super sighed. "5 minutes," he said. "I'm in and out." He went to fetch the key. He opened the door, not quite sure what to expect. Maybe his brother's body hanging from a rope, his tongue swollen and purple and pushed in through the lips. Oh, or on the floor with a bullet through his head, a spray of blood and brain on the wall behind him, or simply dead from the lack of food and water, a heap of skin and bone lying on the floor. Or maybe he would still be alive but naked and shivering, crouched in the corner, and when Jinsey took him by the shoulder and turned him to face back into the room, he would simply look through him without seeing him, without indeed seeing anything around him, alive but for all intents and purposes not really there. Or maybe he would be crouched behind the door with a knife and would immediately come at Jinsey, slitting his throat before realizing who he was, or even slitting his throat because he realized who it was. But none of this happened. Instead, the door opened onto an empty room. Behind it, through the door to the bedroom, was another empty room. The bathroom and his mother's former room were empty as well. There was nobody there and no sign that anybody had been there in a long time.